5.
Hello guys, welcome to this Azure User Group Iceland virtual meetup. My name is Jakob. I just wanted to say 2 words about the giveaway. You have to be, there are a few rules for everybody. You have to be an Icelandic citizen. You have to be marked going to the event, and of course you have to be attending here this virtual meetup. Heini is going to talk about SQL Server plus data lake. Maybe you would like to just take it away, Heini, and yeah. You have the words. I think you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome words, and thank you for having me today. Let me just get my presentation up and running here and shared as well. That would help. So you see something. All right, perfect. So, welcome everyone, and as said in the forewords, we're going to be talking about Azure Data Lake Storage. So that will be our topic today, and I would request that if you have any questions on the way as we go along, just post them in the Q&A. That way we get a little interaction going on here. It's a really interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to having this hour here with you to go through all the things regarding Data Lake. So let's get started. Azure Data Lake Storage is interesting because it's one of those things that seems simple when you first look at it, because it's just storage. You can dump some files in there, and it doesn't really matter what format those files are in. So you kind of have this flexibility of you can get some XML and Parquet and JSON and CSV and so on, and even photos and videos and all that. So it does not really care what the file format is. And that is kind of the challenge with Azure Data Lake Storage, because it can get really crowded in there and a bit messy and a bit jumbled up. And so we need to have some strategies on to how we start using Azure Data Lake Storage and how we make the most use out of it. Because this is one of the major parts when we're talking about data platforms, whether it's a bit with smaller data or even big data architectures. Data Lake Storage is one of the core concepts that we're using. So we're going to start with some basic concepts so that we make sure that we're all on the same map and talking about the same thing. Then we're going to look at a bit about security and making sure that we manage this the correct way. As the third point, we're going to look at structuring Azure Data Lake Storage. As I said, it can get a little crowded and messy quite easily because it's easy to use. And as the last point, we're going to look at how you can integrate this with some analytics services in Azure as well. So there's the kind of the 4 areas that we're going to be covering today regarding Azure Data Lake. And right in this beginning, I think I can see the Q&A. So if you can just pop in if you're using Azure Data Lake Storage or thinking of using it, I get a little bit of feedback from you guys how you've been thinking about this. So if you can just pop into either the chat or Q&A, I'm not sure how that shows up to your side, but whatever you have there that you can use, just pop in. How are you thinking of using it? Are you using it already? It would be nice to get a little feedback of where you're all going. Great, thanks. So I am Heini, and I work for Atea Finland as a solution architect. I've been working extensively with the infrastructure services in Azure as well, but in the past year or 2, I've been moving more towards the data platform solutions and working on the architecture side of those things. And we've been implementing quite a few data platform solutions in the past year that leverage data lake storage on at its core. And it's such an important piece that I was really excited to see that we get to talk about it. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and the architecture part of everything is what I really get excited about. Also, in my past life, I used to be a mathematician, so I still feel a bit like a math nerd at heart. I don't think that can be taken away. And then I also really, you will see, I like doodling, and that's how I create my slides as well. So let's get to it. Let's start with the basic concepts. We've at least gotten some thumbs up for, yes, we are using data lake storage or thinking about it. That's good to know. Great. So let's start with the basic concepts here. If we're completely accurate with the Azure Data Lake Storage, at the moment what we're looking at is the Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. And so I will be talking about that one. There used to be a Generation 1 that was quite different on the back end. So it's worked quite similarly, but kind of the technology underneath it and things like that, it started to look like there were too many restrictions, and so the Generation 2 was created. So if we just get a few concepts settled first, the Azure Data Lake Storage is based on the other Azure storage services. So it is, as you're creating Azure Data Lake Storage, you are creating an Azure storage account. And in Azure Storage Account, you of course get blobs, you get files, you get tables, and you get queues out of the box when you create that. So we don't really see a data lake here. So we kind of have to look deeper to find where it fits in. And so Azure Data Lake is based on the blob side of Azure Storage. And what blob stands out for, if you don't remember, binary large objects files. So essentially it gives us flexibility of creating any kind of content and saving that in the storage account. But this is not quite Azure Data Lake Storage yet, but Azure Data Lake Storage is built on top of the blob service capabilities. What that means is that we get pretty much all the same things out and the same capabilities that are available for blob storage as well, except a few kind of places where we don't. And for example, that would mean that in blob storage, we have, for example, soft delete. So that isn't possible for Azure Data Lake Storage. And there are a few little exceptions there as well that you might want to consider when you're starting to use it or considering using Azure Data Lake Storage. And how does then Azure Data Lake Storage differ from just the regular blob storage? You find this right when you're creating your Azure Data Lake Storage, because you go in and you create a storage account. And when you're going along, you find this tab there that says Hierarchical Namespace. And that is what makes the difference to the Azure Blob Storage service. And what that means is that as in Azure Blob Storage, you didn't actually have folders. You would have things called virtual directories. And when you were using the Azure Portal, it would look like you have folders. But those weren't actually folders. They were just like a path added to that file name. And then what would happen is that as you are, for example, trying to do some operations on the whole folder, that would have to then go through all the files that are within that folder. So the file structure that you would have there in blob storage was not really hierarchical, even though it might look like it through the user interfaces, but it wasn't really that. And that means that some operations would be really slow. If you would, for example, have to update a folder name, that would have to update it to all the files within that one folder. So what this hierarchical namespace really brings to us is that we can leverage, for our data lake, we can leverage that we can do all the operations on the very directory level, because there are actual folders there that we can manage. So if we look at the kind of structure, that means that we have first the same containers that we have on the Blob side. At one point, the container was actually called a file system for data lakes and not a container. And I myself got a whole lot confused about that because, for example, there are files in the Azure storage as well. And that's kind of a different service. So, but it would kind of confuse things with the stuff that is on the data lake side, because you would have a file system. But now they've streamlined it that it is container for both the Blob services as well as the data lake storage. And so that's kind of the first level where you can create multiple containers into your data lake. Then within each of the containers, you can create different folders. And then within each of the folders, you can, of course, have, or directories, you can have more folders or just have your files there. So we get this nice hierarchical system that we would have in any kind of file system, whether it's on our laptop or on a server or anything like that. We have the same structure that we can leverage right in there in Azure Data Lake Storage as well. So that makes it a whole lot useful. Since this Azure Data Lake is built on top of the Blob service, that means that we have the same endpoints that we can use that we were using for Blob service earlier. So if you remember, there was this endpoint called WASP, or WASB, Windows Azure Storage. Oh my gosh. Windows Azure Storage endpoint, nevertheless, and you could leverage that with the Blob storage. And for Azure Data Lake, you can still leverage that one as well. But here we also have the, I have to make sure I don't say this wrong, the Azure Blob File System driver, the ABFS. And this is what makes the data lake so performant and so usable for big data scenarios, because this ABFS, the driver that is used for querying the data, is compatible with the Hadoop-based systems. So if you're using Databricks or a Hadoop running in a virtual machine, anything like that, it will fit together with the Azure data lake endpoint out of the box. So that makes things a whole lot easier. And so as we're looking at what capabilities we have for Azure Data Lake Storage, some of the main points that we have out of the box is that exactly that Hadoop compatible access. And it is due to this ADFS endpoint that we have for Azure Data Lake Storage. And we will look at that in practice, how that works once we move later on into the session today. As well, we also have POSIX permissions, which we do not have for the Azure Blob storage. So we have a little more granularity to how we define access control. So which users or softwares can access what part of the data lake. So this is what the POSIX permissions are doing. So giving specific permissions to do something to the files or directories or else. We'll get to that more in detail in a bit as well. And as the last point is that since we have this ADFS endpoint, which is Hadoop compatible, there is also a driver in the Azure Data Lake Storage, which makes it optimized for big data analytics. So there's this like query acceleration capabilities within Azure Data Lake Storage as well. So it might look like just storage on the surface and just a file system that you can chuck all your files into, but there's a whole lot of capabilities that make it much more performant for analytics workloads and querying the data that is even in flat format in that data lake. So now we've kind of set the stage. We know what we're talking about. We are talking about a service within the Azure Storage Services, which has been built upon the Blob storage services that have been there before. which means we get some blob storage capabilities, but we also get some big analytics capabilities on top of that. And now that means that we can move on to the security part of how do you manage this so that it is governed in a good way, that it's not accessible where it shouldn't be, that the right people have the right access, and so on. So within security, we're going to look at two parts. We're first going to be looking at the networking. And then as the second part, we're going to be looking at access control. And if we start with networking, within that, if we talk about the Azure storage services, remember, this is built upon the Azure storage services. So we have the same networking capabilities as we would have for any other Azure storage service. And what that means is, as this is one of the PaaS services or platform as a service services from Azure, it is not created within a virtual network or anything like that. It does not require a virtual network. And out of the box, you get a public endpoint, and that is the URL you get for your storage account. And back in the days, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, this was your only option. That was it. You have a public endpoint, period. And you couldn't really do anything about that. You maybe had some tweaks that you could do with listing some IPs and whitelisting those, but that was your only option that you could work with. But now we have much more capabilities on how to manage the network traffic that is allowed to reach the storage service that you have created. In this case, Azure Data Lake Storage. So the most simple way to do this is that there's a firewall capability that you can use within the storage. And you can configure these firewall settings so that they fit into your scenario. And the functionalities that you have here is that you can allow Azure services to access your data lake. And as the second point, you can also whitelist IP addresses that can access your Azure Data Lake storage. So you have these two basic capabilities where you can have that public endpoint, but you can have a firewall to that public endpoint and only allow certain things to access your Azure Data Lake. But there's also now the option that you could link your Azure Data Lake storage to a virtual network as well. And this we would do by using private endpoints. So we're not going to go into the technicalities of the virtual networks so much today, unless you ask me questions. If you do, we can go a little more into the detail. But the virtual networks are kind of your private address space and virtual network from within Azure that is just dedicated for you and where you could be creating your virtual machines and things like that. But now we can link our different PaaS services, including the Azure Data Lake Storage, into that virtual network as well. And how this would work is that you create a private endpoint into that virtual network, into one of the subnets of that virtual network to be more specific. And then you link that private endpoint to your Azure Data Lake storage. And so you just make it so that only this data lake storage can only receive traffic from that virtual network and then can only also talk out towards the rest of the world. So we have some options here. We don't need to be totally just like let our data lake be open to all of the world. But of course, the more kind of restricted we go with the networking access, we have to be careful that we're not then blocking some of the traffic that we do need to be able to reach our Azure Data Lake storage. So kind of the firewall configuration is the easiest to maintain and so on, but in some cases you might have these requirements that your data lake has to be maintained within kind of a private network and it should not be accessible from the outside world. And that is completely possible. Then if we go into the access control side of things, we have a few capabilities for the access control of our data lake storage. Again, we have all the capabilities that we have for all the Azure storage services. So for each Azure storage account, as you create it, there's the storage access key. And that key gives access to the entire storage account. So this is not really what you should be using as the default go-to method to authenticate to your Azure Data Lake storage. It can be the easiest, especially if you're just trying things out. The other things can be a little more time consuming and have steps to them to be able to kind of get to the place where you can access your storage. But once you start pulling that access key to multiple places, then you have to be making sure that it's kept secure. And if it's leaked, you have to rotate the keys and so on. So this is kind of the key to all. So never use it unless you absolutely have to. If you're testing it out, fine, use it. That's totally fine. But don't use it in production environments unless you have a situation where you just have to have the master key. But the good thing is we have several different options so we can work around this one. For the storage account, there are also shared access signatures. These are kind of temporary tokens that you create based on the master key of your storage account. So you generate this for a specific time period and give specific rights to that access signature. So this is already much more granular, and you can kind of determine how much access is given by how that shared access signature is created. The challenge with shared access signatures is that they are a bit more difficult to manage. You can create them programmatically, which makes them a little more easy to manage. But with the shared access signatures, once you create it, you have kind of the end date how long it's valid. But if, for example, that key would have to be revoked before that date, you would have to have something called a access policy linked to that shared access signature. So we, again, get a little more complexity in how that setup is built. So again, it might not be the easiest option to go with. Then we start to get to the options that rely on your Azure AD. And that is, of course, nice because then you can leverage the identities of your users if you have people accessing your Azure Data Lake storage. But also, you can have your application identities within your Azure AD and give access to those applications. And the first option is the role-based access control that we have for Azure in general. So you can give access using the RBAC roles to your Azure Data Lake storage. The issue with this one is that you give access the most granular level where you can go is the container level. So the highest level of folder structure that you have within your Azure Data Lake storage. So with the Azure RBAC rules, you cannot give access to one specific file, for example. And that means that you can't get very kind of specific this one. For example, if you have somebody who needs to access just a specific subfolder or a subdirectory within your Azure Data Lake storage, you cannot do with the Azure RBAC roles. But the easy thing about the Azure RBAC roles is that you have this built-in roles like the Azure Storage Blob contributor, Azure Storage Blob's reader, and so on, that you can then, if you have those users that need to have access to the whole storage account, it's really easy to give using that role. But because there might be needs for even more granular access, there is one more option, which is access control lists. And these are the ones that use the POSIX permissions that were mentioned in a previous slide. And what this means is that you can grant access to users or groups to a specific directory or to a specific file, or kind of as granular as you need to go. And within these access control lists, in the kind of the permission side, there are some default permissions in place that you can leverage to make the management of this easier. And of course, if you have a big environment where you have many people contributing to the work and accessing the data, You want to organize your users into groups so you don't have to manage them one by one to that this person has access to this file and this person to that file and so on. You want to make sure you have a little more less management overhead in that case, and using groups will help that a lot. So pretty much if we look at these 4 options, the first 2 are based on keys that you have, and then the second 2 are based on Azure AD identities, and then what kind of permissions you give to those identities in your Azure Data Lake storage. All right, we are starting to get ready to get to the structure part of this session. So we've kind of covered the basics and went through some of the functionalities for security. And then we need to talk about how do you structure your Azure Data Lake storage to make any sense out of it. And just in case you didn't notice the Q&A, remember that if you ask a question, you will increase your chance to get a giveaway in this session. So please, if you have any questions, just throw them in there and we'll grab them as they come in. All right, so next up is the structure part of everything. So if we talk about Azure Data Lake storage and data lakes in general, it is agreed that there needs to be some storage. But if you go searching for this on the internet, you will find all kinds of propositions that you could follow. So it can be a little hard to know what is kind of the red thread that you should be following and what is just based on what kind of situation you're facing. So think about it this way. You have your Azure Data Lake storage, but it's not that your Azure Data Lake storage exists separate from everything else. It means that for your Azure Data Lake storage, there's some data coming in from some data sources, and then it is consumed by some kind of applications or Power BI or machine learning or something like that. There's something always consuming the data. There is one question in the chat, and I will get back to it after the structure section because I already got into this one. So you have always data coming through your data lake, and it has to be organized accordingly, because if you just mix everything together, you do not know what has been the data coming in and what has been the data going out. So if you are looking at different sources on the internet, in books or things, we find always certain things in common. And the thing is that we have to divide the data lake into sections. And for example, in Azure, you could do this by dividing your Azure Data Lake into different containers. So you would have, for example, 3 different containers that you separate your Azure Data Lake into. And there are several names that are used for these specific sections. But on the left side, where we bring data in, you have the area where you have the data just as it is. So you're pretty much not doing any transformations to it as it's coming in. You're just taking it in as it is, not caring about the quality of the data or anything else like that. So you could call that the raw container or the bronze container or anything like that. It's kind of the very raw data that you get in. Then as you do some cleaning and data validation and things like that to it, you would then move that data to a clean section. Then from where you would be you could be certain that your data is pure and there's no kind of missing data or it's not right or so on. And then as the third option, there is the curated section, which is then the data that is prepared into a format that is ready for something to be consumed by. So we get these 3 main areas. Then, depending on where you're looking at this, there have been propositions of having a section that has, for example, temporary data. If you have no temporary data in your kind of data sources, that everything kind of is kept into the raw section, no, you don't need that. But you could have a situation where you do need that. Also, if you have a lot of people doing kind of exploration on the data, you might want to have a kind of a fourth section that is just exploration, because then you make sure that that kind of data that is produced by the exploration and testing and doing some data science and machine learning and things like that, it doesn't get put into the cleaned area, because then that wouldn't be quite clean data, because that exploration data often has to be verified and confirmed and made sure that that is actually clean and it's going to be used by some systems. So I'd say when you're thinking about how to organize your Azure data lake, start with these three main areas. If you do need a fourth or a fifth area, that's totally okay. Think about the use case that you are thinking about and kind of figure out if you need more areas than this. And there has been another question in the chat. I will get to that one as well as we get to the end of the structure section. But how, this is just the container level. After the containers, we also have the folder structure, the directories, and so on. And that means that we have to have some kind of way also to structure the data within these three areas. So if we think about the raw section, this is the area where we pull data in, and we want to bring it in as it is as much as possible. So that means that we want to organize it into the raw area by the source system that it's coming from. And that means that you would have one folder, for example, per source system. If you want to have one higher folder from that, that kind of separates those by area. But then within each source system, if you have new data coming in, for example, every day, you could then have monthly folders and then have the days of that month within that folder. But it always depends on how often are you getting data in. If you are getting, for example, some kind of sensor data or event data that comes in at a very high speed, that means you have to go into a more granular level with separating your folders within that one source system folder. Then the cleaned area, I would start to putting it into the same structure as you put it in the curated area. And in the curated area, you want to have the folder structure by the usage of how that data is used, because it's not necessarily going to be the same structure that it was coming in from the data sources, because you might be doing some combining of the data and leveraging transformations and so on. And then you would take the steps to move them on, and then a combination of those data would be leveraged by, for example, a Power BI report or so on. All right, there is the basic structure. The tricky thing with the structure is that it depends. That is like the most frustrating answer, I know, but it does depend a little bit on your data and how you are going to use it, how you kind of structure those folders. But just know, kind of try to go to a level where it's not that you have in one folder you have like thousands and thousands of files without being able to distinguish between those. And the same thing at the curated and raw end. All right, we've had quite some questions coming in, so I'm going to take a little moment to just go through some of those questions at this point before we move on to how you integrate this with different services on Azure. So the first question is that, can you control access to files with storage access keys? So with a certain key, you only have access to specific files. And the answer is yes. I can show some of these in practice at the end of today. With the storage access keys, with the storage access keys, that is the main kind of the master key of the storage account. So let me take that back. The storage access key is the main storage key, and that will give you access to the entire storage account. But then we have the shared access signatures, which are kind of generated from the master key. And with the shared access signatures, with those you can go either to the container level, that's one option, and you can also go to the very file level. But I would propose that you instead go to the access control lists, because those are more easy to manage than the shared access signatures. And even if you have an application that is putting data or getting data from the Azure Data Lake, you just create an identity for that application in Azure AD. We will look at this in more detail, and then you will use that identity to read or write the data. So that is my proposition when you're using Azure Data Lake storage. Then I'm going to pick a little bit the order here. So we have two questions regarding moving of data. There is a question regarding what is the best way to move on-premises data to Data Lake, use push or pull via data gateway through data factory, etc. So when you're doing batch movements, I think the most used method is Azure Data Factory, or if you're using some kind of other integration tool in your environment already, you could use that same tool, even if it's not an Azure tool, to bring that data into Azure Data Lake. Most tools might not have an Azure Data Lake connector yet in them, but you can always use an HTTPS call to write the data into Azure Data Lake. But yes, Azure Data Factory is really easy and fantastic for this, because you do have that Data Lake connector, and you can just link to whatever on-premise data source you have. But it does mean that you have to have that gateway which will pull the data to Azure, which in the Data Factory case is called the integration runtime. So you have to have that installed on premises, so you can pull the data from your on-premise environment and then move that to Azure Data Lake. You could also use logic apps, or as it is said here, flows in the other question. So there are triggers and tasks in flows and logic apps which have basically the same functionalities and backend in them. You just get a little more code control with logic apps. And if you're moving data from on-premises, again, you need the gateway for that one, which is the on-premise gateway that you would also use with, for example, Power BI and so on. So that all works. Then we had one more question, which is that, is it possible to connect to Azure Data Lake from Power Apps? It is possible to connect from Power BI to Azure Data Lake. Let me just double check that it's, my thinking is that it is possible in Power Apps, because, for example, if you create a common data model service, that would be stored in Azure Data Lake as well. And so I do think it is possible, but let me just double check. In my opinion, it should be possible. Yes. Yes, you can. All right. Very nice. Thanks for the questions. That's always nice. And if you have any more, keep them just coming. All right, we're kind of getting to the really beef of this presentation, because the thing is, as I was saying here, the data lake never kind of, if you have just an Azure data lake, then it's just data laying in storage, and you're not leveraging it in many ways. So we do have to have this linked to some other services, so we can get the benefit and value from our data that we're storing in the Azure Data Lake. So lastly, we're gonna go to service integrations. And in general, a lot of the Azure services integrate with Azure Data Lake, including Data Factory and Logic Apps, as was just covered. You can link to Azure Data Lake from Power BI and Power Apps as well, as was mentioned. But But you can also link to Azure Data Lake from all of those Hadoop-based systems, as we were talking about the ADFS endpoint. All those services can connect to Azure Data Lake as well. But we're going to be looking at this from the point of view of an example. I think that's the easiest way to look at it. And if you have any specific questions about how it integrates with a specific service, just shoot that into the questions, and we can then look at that specific one in this case. So as said, you're going to have your storage account, which is the Azure Data Lake storage in this case, and you have some data sources from where you're pulling your data in from. And one option to move your data is the Azure Data Factory. That is one way to go. And Azure Data Factory is the best when you're talking about batch data movement, or for example, you need to be pulling incremental kind of refreshes of data from your data sources, whether they're on premises or in Azure or in other cloud services. All that works very well. Just as an additional comment, if you do have something more like a streaming data set, then Data Factory might not be the best for that one, but I would propose using, for example, Event Hubs, or if you have IoT devices, even IoT Hub. But that's a little side note. Here we're kind of looking at this more traditional way where you have more just standard movements that you have to do to your data. So you would be bringing your data in using Azure Data Factory, and you will be storing that in your data lake. And as we were discussing within that data lake, you have your areas. You have the raw area, you have the cleaned and the curated. So that Data Factory would be moving the data to the raw area in your Azure Data Lake storage. But it means that we might need to do some cleanup of the data, or some, as the next step, some aggregation of the data, getting some sums or averages, or doing some transformations on the data. And for that, we will probably need some other services to use to do those aggregations or cleanups. And one example would be to use Azure Databricks. And we would essentially be linking Azure Databricks with the Azure Data Lake. And just to bring in the things that we were talking about earlier, because we're connecting to other services, that will also determine how we do the networking side and the access control side. And for example, in this case, it means that we will have to be using some of the ACLs, so the access control lists, to give access to these Azure services that need to write or read from the Azure Data Lake. And then as the second step, it means that the networking needs to allow for Azure services to access the Azure Data Lake as well. So we right away get some kind of definitions for how we need to configure our data lake once we look at the kind of landscape. Where are we setting the Azure Data Lake? And then, since we're using an external application to work with our data in the Azure Data Lake, it means that that application needs to have an identity in Azure AD, so that that identity will have access to do certain operations on the data in the data lake. All right. So to make this a little more concrete, we're going to be looking at this in practice, how this happens. So, nope. There we go. Let me get this. That wasn't a good idea. A little bigger here. So we are in the Azure Portal here. And I have created a resource group for the resources here for this event, actually. And so I have a storage account here, and it looks like any storage account. But if I click in here, you can see that in the container tab here, it shows the lake picture there. If you had a regular Azure storage account, it would not have the kind of the water in there, so to say. And we were talking about the firewalls and virtual networks. For example, you can see that this specific Azure storage account is configured to accept traffic from all networks. So in the real world, we'll choose instead selected networks, then add some of your organization trusted IPs, and then probably also have to allow trusted Microsoft services to access this storage account. Because that way you can have your Azure Data Factory write and read into the storage account, as well as, for example, use the Azure Databricks. As the other component here, I have the Azure Databricks service. If you're not familiar with this one, this is kind of a packaged Apache Spark cluster that you are creating in the background, and a service where you get all this management and how you create notebooks, and you can have all the management layer things on top of that cluster. And since we don't have so much time, I don't think I can get to more specifics than that, but this is one tool that you could use for working with your data in Azure Data Lake. So as I was saying, we will need an identity for the Azure Databricks service so that that can write into the Azure Data Lake. So that means that in my environment, I have an Azure Active Directory here. And there is also an app registration here that I have created for the Azure Databricks service. And so, of course, you could create this from scratch. And let me actually show that. It doesn't take a lot. So you create a new registration. In a lot of cases, it doesn't really matter which application you are using, but you will need an identity for it in Azure AD if you are then giving it access to the Azure Data Lake storage as well. And pretty much I don't have to give anything else but the name for that. And when I register this application, I get an application ID for this one. So then we will be using that when we call Azure services from that, for example, in this case from Databricks. And then on top of that, we need to create a certificate for this one. So it essentially needs a password, and that's what this client secret is doing. So we're adding a client secret, and here I get the value of that client secret. So that way we have both an ID for the application we're going to call it from, and then the secret that we're going to use for calling it. So we have our data lake, and I also have a Databricks workspace that I created earlier because it just takes a little time. So I knew that we might not have time to wait for that. So I created that ahead of time. So this is what the workspace looks like when you navigate here from the portal. And before we get into here, let me check. There are some more questions here. Let me check this. Okay, there are very good questions, I have to say. So I just wanted to check how many questions there are so I know how much time to leave in the end for the questions. So let's just check this to the end. And I have prepared some notebooks here. So let's take this one. So within as I said, within the Databricks, you have clusters that you can use. This one is actually, the cluster isn't started. I need to go in and start that cluster. Let's start that. So that will take a little moment until it gets running. But as we wait for that, I can show you these notebooks here. So how this works is that whatever tool you're using to communicate with Azure Data Lake Storage, you have to have some way to authenticate to Azure, and then that user or application needs to have access to do things in Azure Data Lake Storage. So what we're doing here in the very beginning, we're setting some configurations. So first example, we are setting that the authentication type is OAuth. And then we are setting that the token provider is the client credential one. Then we are setting the client credentials where we are giving the client ID, which is the application ID that we just created. Then we're giving the client secret here. And then we are getting a token from our tenant. And here is my Azure AD tenant ID as well here in the link. So there are a few things. You can find these scripts online, but you do have to replace some of your own values in there. And then, as you can see, here is the data lake storage that I was showing you. And within that storage, I have a raw container. And here you can see this ABFS, and this is the Azure Blob storage, the driver that we can, or the endpoint that we're going to be using, because this is what the Databricks can communicate with. And so first we're kind of getting the credentials and linking to the container. Then in this case, we're just getting some data from GitHub and putting just temporarily linking that to the cluster that we're starting here. So you can see it's in the temp file folder. And then we can just directly query that storage that we have in Azure Data Lake from here using the ABFS endpoint. And the SS here just means that it's the secure version. And then we can directly query that with SQL. Pretty cool, I think. But we do have to wait a moment longer for this cluster to start up. Unfortunately, I forgot to start it up a little earlier. So while we wait, let's take a look at the questions here. Okay, how far did we get? So I'm gonna kind of tweak the order here again a little bit, and so there's one question, which is that if I have a microservice.NET Core microserver running in a Docker container in Azure, which is consuming data in a data lake, is that something that is easy to do? So yes, there are libraries for communicating with the Azure storage, pretty much with all the coding languages that you can leverage on Azure. So, and .NET Core, yes, you can do that. You just have to kind of find the right SDKs that you need to use. And for that one, I can pull out the link in a bit and just reply that to your question there in a moment, once we kind of get to the end. Then there's the question regarding, is it possible for me to use the Polybase feature in SQL Server to connect to data lake data via SQL Server, which is on premises? Yes, as long as your SQL Server can communicate and can reach the data lake. So as long as the networking side is functioning, yes, you can. So it's pretty much the Polybase, whether you use it in, for example, the Azure Synapse or the formerly data warehouse. If you use the Polybase there, it works the same in the SQL Server in the more recent versions. And then as the last question here, I think I skipped one, so I'll get back to that. How would you go about monitoring data transformation tasks and get alerted if tasks fail and so on? So one really common way to go about this is that you use Data Factory as the way to trigger all of these transformations. Because, for example, you can have a Databricks notebook as one task in your data factory. So you can have your notebook in Databricks, and then you can just trigger that in Data Factory. And if you have all of your transformations and pipelines of what you do with the data within Data Factory, then you only have one place where you have to be monitoring those. And if that one Databricks notebook fails, then you get alerted through Azure Data Factory. So that is one of the easiest ways to just ensure you have those in one place. Of course, you can do a whole lot of scheduling and triggering through the Databricks service by itself. So you could also have the monitoring within the Databricks service just by itself and have the triggers and schedules there. But then, of course, you're just restricted to using the Databricks service. Yes. And then the last question was, where did it go here? It's that one. So the last question here is that, are there Azure Data Lake connectors and tasks in the latest version of SSIS, or the SQL Server Integration Services 2019, which can be used to integrate on-premise data with Azure Data Lake? I know it is possible to do this. Let me just double check whether there is a connector, kind of a ready-made connector, or if you have to kind of use the different things there. So there's, in some cases, you might have an Azure storage connector, which you can still leverage because the Azure Data Lake is built on top of that. But in some cases, you have an Azure Data Lake specific connector that you can leverage. Yes, the August 2019 release has the connection with Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So the newest versions definitely have it. It came in at that point. Nice, we are running out of time here. And perfectly, our cluster is up, so I'm just going to show how this all works. If you're not familiar to notebooks, you're going to get quite a bit in just a short amount of time. So pretty much I'm running these cells from the notebook one at a time. And it is going to be first setting all these configurations. And let's see what happens here. It is the first run, so it can take a little time for it to kind of warm up, so to speak. So pretty much it's kind of, it is attaching this notebook to the cluster, and then it is running that configuration and seeing if it can connect to the Azure Data Lake storage. And let's see how this goes. That's taking a little longer than usual. Okay, there we go. Now it's running the command. So you can kind of see the status over here, and it didn't give any kind of error, so that was good. It was able to get attached to the Data Lake storage. And here it's just getting some data from GitHub. So if you would you find any kind of data source that you want to play with in GitHub, you can use a similar command to get that, and that is complete, 100%. And then this one is copying that data in Azure Data Lake and kind of linking that to a temp destination here on the cluster. And then we're going to go and run ahead creating a table into the cluster that it's then going to leverage in the next step and just kind of show what kind of data comes out. And then as a last step, we're just going to do an SQL query here. And you see we kind of get a visual of what kind of data there is. If you would need to see this in a chart, for example, this happens to have kind of, are they a free or a paid user, and then by gender. So unfortunately, time is up. I can't believe it flew by so fast. So that is it for today. And I just want to say thank you for this hour. It went by really, really fast. I can't believe how fast it went. And Thanks for having me, and I hope you got something out of this session. And I will stick around for a little bit to share some links to the questions that were asked here. So I will be here for a little bit, and then I'm trying to get to my last slide here. Thank you so much, and if you want to, find me on Twitter or on LinkedIn and connect and reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Heini, for your time.
You're welcome.
I would like to remind everybody about the giveaway. Check our Facebook group for that, and I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. It was very nice, Heini. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Yes. So I will be answering some of the questions here. If you feel like your answer didn't get answered, just send in a question real soon. I'll hang around for a bit to answer those. Thank you.